learning and discrimination, part of the problem or a solution. My name is Vincent Badenhagen. I'm happy to welcome you in the name of the Analytics Club at ETH Zurich. We're a student organization with a mission to foster the data science community in Zurich. I want to thank a great team of organizers for making this event possible. Peppa and Johannes, who will resolve technicalities in the background, Theodora and Elia will manage your questions and bring them to the podium, and David and Friederike will moderate the discussion. Without such a crowd of motivated students, this type of event would not be possible. Before I start introducing our panelists, let me give a few words of the structure of today's event. After I've concluded my welcoming words and introduced the panelists, I'll hand over to them for giving a brief input presentation of 5 minutes on some particularly interesting aspects of their recent work. This will give us a clearer understanding of the core of their interests and important topics in the field. During these presentations, you can already start thinking of questions for the expert discussion. You should post them on pigeonhole.at. The link is shared in the chat as I speak. Please assign all your questions to one of the topics: bias in AI, which corresponds to the question, how does AI reinforce bias and discrimination? Uncover bias, which corresponds to questions in the area, how might AI be deployed to uncover discrimination? And regulation, which is a short form for the general perspective on how can we ensure that the deployment of AI serves the general good. These tags, Theodora and Elia will orient the selection towards the most voted questions, so do also please vote if there's a question you find particularly interesting. After the discussion among the panelists have concluded, you'll get the chance to meet your fellow attendees in a Wonder.me room. There you can discuss in smaller groups all the questions that you have either gotten through the expert discussion or that could not be solved there. If you have any organizational or technical questions, please post them in the chat or directly address Peppa or Johannes. Muted by the host. So without further ado, as one says, I will introduce the panelists. So let's come to the heart of this event. For this, it's a pleasure to introduce our 3 great panelists in alphabetical order. We are extremely happy that they took their time to be here today. So welcome to our first panelist, Elliott Ash, Assistant Professor of Law, Economics and Data Science at ETH Zurich Center for Law and Economics, Switzerland. From personal experience, I can say that he is a great lecturer that can infect students with enthusiasm for his topics. Elliott investigates the working of law and policy, using tools from data science, especially computational linguistics. With a laser focus on natural experiments, the goal is to produce evidence of causation rather than correlation. Welcome also to our second panelist, Katharina Buch, who is currently working on her PhD at TU Berlin in the area Sociology of Technology. Her work focuses on how gender is encoded into AI. In addition to her research, she's a lecturer for gender and AI at TU Berlin and engages in public sector projects. Lately, she has written an expertise on racism and AI for the German government, and in the past, she worked as a consultant for mainly public sector projects on digitalization and Industry 4.0. To complete our podium, we welcome Anna Mätzener, Managing Director of AlgorithmWatch Switzerland. She will bring her expert experience working in the non-profit research and advocacy organization AlgorithmWatch. The organization is committed to evaluating and shedding light on algorithmic decision-making processes that have sorry, I was muted by the host. Anna Mätzener holds a PhD in mathematics from the University of Zurich, where she also minored in philosophy and Italian linguistics. Once again, thank you all for taking this time to make this event possible. Now let's go to the key part of the event. For that, I would like to ask Elliott to share his screen and give us his 5-minute intro on one interesting or multiple interesting aspects of his work.
Thank you, Vincent, for the introduction, and thank you for having me for what I hope to be an interesting discussion. I'm going to start with this picture of a crotchety judge, a crotchety human judge, as a way to set the stage for what is the baseline for algorithms contributing to decision making. Because we aren't just comparing an unfair algorithm or an imperfect algorithm to a perfect algorithm. We're comparing an imperfect algorithm to humans. And judges, as is the case with all human beings, they have a conscience. They might have their better nature telling them to make the right decision. They might have their less better, their worse nature, giving them some biases or making them be inconsistent or lazy. And you can see this in many examples. For example, in U.S. asylum courts. There's one court where there's one judge that gives that grants 91% of asylum requests, while another judge only grants 3%. So human judges are not that consistent. And so you can imagine replacing this angel, which we just have to trust the humans, with a robot, which we might have some influence over. So just to give you a quick example of how we might do this from my research, we have some data on Brazilian municipalities, and we care about corruption in these local governments, where we have data on 1,500 municipalities, and about half of them actually have corruption. So in Brazil, localities unfortunately have a lot of corruption. And because this is such an important policy issue, we would like to see if algorithms can support decision-making in terms of targeting audits. And so to get at this question, we collect data on about 800 local budget features on their revenues and expenditures. And we ask, can an XGBoost model, a gradient boosting machine, predict the presence of corruption? And it turns out the answer is yes. We get about an 80% accuracy, 0.78 AUC, in predicting corruption in municipalities that the algorithm has not seen information on. So this is pretty useful because you can imagine, rather than just relying on human judgment about where to find corruption, we can produce some measures, some corruption risk estimates for all municipalities in Brazil and try to root it out. And it turns out that if you take the most corrupt municipalities along this corruption measure, you could detect more than twice as much corruption based compared to a random assignment of audits. So what's another way that we can use algorithms to get at some aspects of problems in human decision making? So in some more of my research, we use word embeddings to analyze the use of gendered language in judicial opinions. So if you start off with the difference between man and woman, and also define the difference between work and family, you can get at a continuous measure in a judge's opinions of how often male and work are associated, how often female and family are associated. And this is this classic gender stereotype, which we'd like to relate to their decisions. And it turns out that, as you'd expect, female judges have less gender stereotypes than male judges. And also judges with more daughters relative to sons use fewer gender stereotypes. And it turns out this matters in the sense that stereotype judges tend to vote against expanding women's rights. And they also tend to reject or reverse the decisions of their female judge colleagues. So just to recap and give you kind of a broader view of algorithms and bias, I think we face this question of how to make algorithms fair. And under the standard approach, we would take all the data available to us to make a decision, such as whether someone should get bail or go to jail. And the problem is that you might have these protected classes, such as religion, that the algorithm might use to make this decision. So what we might call fairness through unawareness is you're just dropping the religion identifiers from the data set. But the problem is that the algorithm could quite easily learn these types of correlations between religion and other things that you might want to use. And so discrimination can get through indirectly. This is part of this more general problem that data can be biased. So if you have automated essay grades that are trained to reproduce the biases of teachers, they'll also be biased. You have this similar problem for doing criminal risk scoring, because Criminal histories might be produced by a biased system, and subsequent recidivism might also be biased. So we can ask ourselves, when should algorithms decide? So if we think about kind of machine perception, so medical diagnosis from scans, that's usually going to have some surmountable solutions. When you try to make decisions based on past behavior, such as automated essay grading, the problem is that these are reward systems. So people will try to game them, and you'll have to continually monitor and update them to make sure they are staying fair. But if you're making decisions based on predicted future behaviors, such as recidivism, or measuring gender attitudes and making decisions about that, you have to be very careful, because when you make decisions, those then affect the subsequent behavior, and you can't observe the counterfactual. So these are very risky systems because the errors are costly, there's strong incentive responses, and they can have unintended consequences. So I look forward to discussing this further in the Q&A.
Perfect. Thanks a lot, Elliott, for this intro presentation. We'll directly shift over to Katharina for her first thoughts, our project presentation. So you can share your screen.
Yeah, thank you a lot. So I'm going to shift a bit the focus to a more bird's eye view, basically, and more on how do we get there? Why do we have so many biased algorithms potentially? And so I am researching women who are researching AI. And hence, I wanted to give you a view on how the world of AI research looks right now. So to put it bluntly, it's a white man's world currently still. And what we see is that in Germany, we have like roughly 15% of leading researchers are women in AI. And overall in Europe, computer science master students only account for between 17 to 38%. The huge difference between those numbers is actually quite interesting, and something potentially interesting for our discussion afterwards as well. And interestingly enough, we do see a decline actually in many European states. So contrary to what many of us might believe, that we are like progressing and gender parity might be reached, actually when it comes to AI research and computer sciences specifically, in certain countries, we actually see that it flattens, that we get less women into the area. And I also wanted to broaden the scope a bit, because we tend to always talk about Europe and how it is down here. And so I also brought up the example of India, where we see that women actually make up about 45% of undergrads in computer sciences, so quite a lot. But the pipeline is rapid. So when it comes to the workforce, it's only 30%. When it comes to actual researchers, scientists, it's only 10% actually. And let's not even talk about like C-level executives, like science technology officers, when we are down to like 1%. So we see a massive lack of women in this field, and also people of color, which is not my research field, but I think is important to mention in this context. So why is this such a problematic thing potentially? The thing is that humans, and therefore programmers, are knowledge holders, and their knowledge is perspectival. What does this mean? This means that they perceive the world through their specific position, through their cultural and social framework. And so the AI systems we see are built by value-driven people, where norms, where morals, where ethics can influence like construction and design. And people developing AI usually come from a similar cultural and social background. So this might lead to designs for the world we live in that are mainly shaped by a homogeneous group. And those homogeneous groups can be problematic, especially because we see over and over again that a lack of diversity also leads to a lack of thoughts. What do I mean by this is that those homogeneous groups tend to lead to a certain sense of herd mentality, to less questioning, to less thinking outside of the box, basically. this leads A, to a lack of innovation, which is a very practical issue, and B, also to a lack of understanding and consideration for the world, the lived experiences of people outside your own framework, and for potential hazards. This way, bias creeps in quite often from the code itself to unrepresentative data sets that don't include people who are not part of the building team, basically. And also, this obviously reinforces power imbalances we have seen before. And I also wanted to play the devil's advocate for myself for a second, because as much as this might be a problem, the question is a more diverse team actually a solution? Because a diverse team not necessarily leads to a diverse mindset. And this is because even if you're part of an underrepresented group, you might be more aware of like bias and problems, even though this might all hold true, you are not exempt from harvesting unconscious bias. And as a human, basically, we live in a society. So what I mean by this, obviously, is that we all are part of the societal frame we are put in. So we are still acting inside those constraints, inside those expectations as well. And also, most choices in this field are driven by money in the end. So even though you might be aware of certain biases, certain problems, you might actively act against them or better in favor of them because you believe to act inside a certain, for example, gender stereotype might be more marketable. So even though you do know of the problems, that doesn't mean you solve them. So yeah, with that, I would leave it back to you.
Thanks a lot for this very interesting different perspective. And then for the next input presentation, Anna, could you share the screen and get started?
Yes, thank you very much, Vincent, for the nice introduction, also for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. I will first just briefly tell you who we are as an organization. You have already mentioned it. We're a nonprofit research and advocacy organization that is committed to watch, unpack, and analyze automated decision-making systems and their impact on society. So the first thing you'll notice is that I don't speak of AI. I speak of automated decision-making systems, which we very often do because we believe that calling this thing, which lacks of a clear definition, as we probably all know, artificial intelligence gives it too much humanity and in some sense too much power. So we prefer to call it automatic decision-making system to take that a bit away and to be able to take a step back to look at it a bit more objectively maybe. Also, well, how do we work? We are an organization, we exist since around 5 years from Berlin, since September 2020. There's also a Swiss office or branch or whatever you want to call it. We're funded fully at the moment by the Pioneer Fund from the Migros until the end of next year. We are now 3 people working here and the full team is around 20 people. We do research work, we do advocacy work, we do journalistic work, journalistic research, and also try to raise awareness for those kinds of questions in the very broad public. So that's a bit of background information on us. What I would like to talk about briefly is a very recent project that we did that was, we developed some impact assessment tool for the use of ADM in the public sector. That was a study that we could perform for the Canton Zurich, and the question that was asked was what legal and ethical frameworks are needed for the use of ADM in the public sector. That was a joint project with Nadia Braun-Binder, who's a law professor at the University of Basel. With her team, she took care of the legal part in her team, and we took care of the ethical question in collaboration with Michaela Loy, who is an ethicist currently also at the University of Zurich. Yeah, and I will not talk about the legal questions so much because it's also, I'm not an expert in this, but I can answer some questions if some will come up later. I will basically mostly talk about the ethical part because that's what we developed. So there are a lot of frameworks and recommendations on how to deal with AI or ADM in the public sector, and those are published by companies, by the authorities, by civil societies. Some of them are very good, and some of them lack something, but they all give some valuable advice, but they also have some problem. What they often have is some kind of calculation of an ethics score that then is based on some categories like, does this happen often or not so often, which is completely subjective, and it doesn't really make that much sense to use that to give you a number on the ethics score or something. So far, there's also no label that's been accepted by everyone so that we could say this is ethical use of ADM and this is not. So there's some problems there. Also, usually we have an ex post assessment of ADMs, so they are analyzed only once they're put into place and not during the whole planning and testing phase. Also, it's a snapshot. Nothing happens if an ADM changes while it's being used. So we think that's also a problem. So what we did was try to do something different. We tried to have a different approach which accompanies the project during all the important phases of planning, testing, and then also during operations. We don't do scores, but we try to react to difficult aspects, and we do so by writing a transparency report. Oh, the governmental department who installs an ADM has to write this, and this is also a documentation of all the steps that have been taken through the whole process. What we did take from the different frameworks we have were ethical principles and instrumental principles. I will not go into these in detail because it would take too long. We did take the blue ones. You can also find the orange ones in different frameworks. What you will see, I will just talk about one of them, is transparency. This is a word that appears very often in these discussions, and very often it is talked about like it's a goal or something, but we like to be very clear about this, that we don't think transparency can be the goal, but it's a means to get to the goal of having an ethical use of ADM. Transparency does not solve the problems that there are. So what we developed were two checklists. Checklist one is a triage checklist. This is a bunch of questions about ethical principles that you can basically answer with yes or no. Does it use personal data? Yes or no? And if you don't know whether it does, you also answer yes, because then this makes you document the fact that you actually don't know whether it uses personal data or not, for example, which then is the checklist number 2, which is the transparency checklist, which checklist 1 determines then what of checklist 2 you have to answer in order to document whatever you think about during the whole process. How this is being done is by using a flow chart. I know that you cannot read this because it's too small, but what you will see is the blue squares. Those are the questions from checklist 1. And you will see that there's always a yes or no arrow. Yes is green, no is red. If you say no, you go to the next question. If you say yes, it says you must write a transparency report. You should answer number so-and-so from checklist 2. Those questions will be answered during the planning phase, during the testing phase. So for example, you identify the use of personal data, and then you document how it is in the testing phase being made sure that there's not a problem with this. And in the end, you document whether there is a risk that is still there and why it's okay that it is still there. And this report can then be put together in a report that can at least internally be somewhere accessible and stored, and parts of that could also be made public for the people living somewhere and using public services that use these ADM systems. So with that, I'm at the end of my short presentation, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Very good. Thanks also from your side. Now I'll hand over to David and Friederike to actually lead the discussion. For the Q&As, the link was posted again to write them there and vote on them.
Thank you, Vincent. Hello and welcome from my side as well. My name is Friederike. I am a master student at ETH in Zurich, and together with David, I have the pleasure to lead you through this evening tonight. We are very excited to have everyone here today for what we hope to be a really interesting discussion on machine learning and discrimination. And we aim to promote a culture of responsible innovation, and we hope that this discussion is contributing to this. Again, I want to encourage everyone to post questions. Whatever you're interested in, use this opportunity that we now have these experts here who can answer them. All right, let's start.
Thank you very much, Friederike. In this first section of the discussion, we are going to zoom out a bit again and talk about why fairness of artificial intelligence, AI for short, is relevant and in what domains in particular. To prevent us from getting hung up on debating the definition of artificial intelligence, as Anna already kind of mentioned, allow me to simplistically define AI systems as computer programs that learn how to make classifications, predictions, or decisions based on training data without ever having been explicitly taught how. Due to this circumstance, it is often hard to explain the functioning of these systems other than by considering their outcomes. Meaning that in the domain of artificial intelligence, it is common to sacrifice explainability for performance. Now, hoping that this rudimental basis suffices to starting off the discussion, I would like to pose our first question to you, Elliott. Would you mind giving us a brief overview on why AI might reinforce discrimination, at which stages of the AI lifecycle biases get commonly introduced, and if these are characteristic to the paradigm of artificial intelligence?
Sure. Thank you, David. Interesting and inclusive question that touches on much of what we've discussed so far. I think that, as I mentioned in my presentation, one important source is bias in the data. So as you mentioned, if training data is produced by humans, which are biased or inconsistent in some way, prejudiced towards some groups or discriminatory towards others, then a AI decision system that is designed to replicate those human decisions will also be biased. And I think there needs to be more research on this, but I think there's a big risk of it even amplifying those biases because it will become more consistently biased, right? So I think that this is a significant problem. Beyond that, there's issues of incentive responses to the algorithms once they're deployed, and so if an algorithm becoming deployed, for example, changes whether people get a credit card because there's automated credit scoring, or they don't apply for asylum because there's automated asylum decisions, this could lead to further unfairness through affecting behavior. And I think that thirdly, in this related to your explainability point, there could be this lack of trust or lack of trustworthiness in these automated systems because people don't understand how they work. And I think that this is a rapidly developing literature and technology of developing tools to try to interpret what AI can do. This will always be somewhat limited. I think that is important to note, and we won't get 100% transparency on these systems, but I think that keeping a human in the loop and having a mechanism for human appeal is going to be critical in maintaining fairness of the broader system.
Thank you, Elliott. So now that we've heard what the potential problem is and why it occurs, I have a question for you, Anna. So at AlgorithmWatch, you are working on exactly this problem. You've tried to find algorithmic decision-making processes that are already of social relevance. What are situations in which AI algorithms or algorithmic decision-making processes are already a real risk and not a potential risk? So in which situations, particular here in Switzerland or in Europe?
I can give you an example which is quite simple that you have probably all come across. So if you are looking for a job, you can use Facebook for that. You can go on Facebook and look for jobs, and Facebook will not list all the jobs that are posted there that exist there. It will look at your profile and match jobs that fit to you, to your profile. So it will show you, for example, jobs in Zurich and not in New York, because it might be more convenient for you right now. Facebook thinks to apply to something near where you live and not something far away, even though it would maybe be nice to move to New York, but that's besides the question. But then it will also see this person is a woman or a man. Let's take the other genders out of the picture for a moment, just for the sake of simplicity. And it will show you different jobs based on your gender. If you are a woman, it might show you more jobs in the sector of childcare or nursing or something. If you are a man, it might show you more technical jobs. And this is actually, we could prove that this is being done. Even if the job ads are written in a way that they are explicitly looking for a woman driving trucks, they will show that job ad to men, because truck driver is a job that is being done by men and not by women, as the society used to think, of course. So this is something that is very close to our daily life, I would say, and it actually has a very bad impact, because all those young women who would like to become a truck driver will not see those job ads, and vice versa. The men who would like to work in nursing, they might not even see the jobs that could fit them.
Yeah, thank you. Very interesting. So as a final question in our introduction part, in the first section of our discussion, I want to pose one question to Katharina. So you already mentioned in your input presentation that there's a lack of diversity. So not all diverse perspectives are being considered. And machine learning is a deeply technical research field, and bias is very difficult to detect, can sometimes be very subtle. So we would need experts of sociology or psychology that are involved. I want to ask you not only about diversity in terms of ethical, religious, and other groups, but also in terms of scientific backgrounds. How well are we currently ensuring that machine learning is not treated as a purely technical problem? Are there many interdisciplinary teams involved?
Can I just answer? Not at all. I think this actually, it's a huge problem, because even though most technical teams by now try to think about societal impact, what they do has, the big problem is that they totally underestimate the scope and the depth of considering this perspective. This is not done by a easy checklist. This is not done by, Anna fortunately mentioned this whole post ex post. That's the whole ex post approach is really problematic in my opinion, and I think contributed a lot by the fact that most of the teams we see are primarily, if not only, led by computer scientists who are coming from the technical perspective. And so I do believe that it is by far not enough to have like one introductory seminar for students of computer sciences on diversity and ethics. That is not the fix. There was this beautiful paper written shortly before this. What was the headline? Well, it was basically this idea that there is this tendency still of computer scientists and in general people who study MINT and work in MINT to disregard the softer sciences a bit, to be like, yeah, it's important, but we can integrate it by like working an hour on it. And it's like, well, I don't think it works, because I think we have seen by now that it doesn't work, because we see this again and again. Like it's like this ongoing cycle that we have like an application is built, we see a bias inside, social scientists, philosophers, etc. come along and say, oh, this is problematic, work on this, then we work on that. But then we get into this whole cycle again. Like we never break out of it. We are not moving forward by now. So yeah.
Thank you. Elliott, can you confirm that here at ETH, like who's mainly attending your courses on exactly that topic?
Yes, interesting question. I think ETH might be an outlier just because it's such a technical school. So there aren't really very many bachelor's or master's students in humanities to attend the class, even if they wanted to, unfortunately. I think that this is more balanced at other universities, but I think that Katharina's definitely right, and this is also a complex issue that will take. There's no easy fix. I want to reflect that I think Katharina made a very interesting point earlier about problems of representation in just the AI system, among the AI system designers, and this is something that I don't think is considered enough. It's somewhat related to this point that David and I discussed previously about bias in the data, but there could just be these biases or values, preferences or approaches to life that are kind of baked into how algorithms are built to make predictions, but also how they're used to make decisions. And oftentimes, like in the case of credit scoring, for example, if you're deciding whether to give someone a loan, having some prediction about whether they will default is a useful factor, but it's not the only factor. Humans can take those other special circumstances much better than an AI system or an automated decision-making system, as Anna would say. And also, I agree with that framing. I'm just used to saying AI now, but it's not, machine learning is not intelligence, period. And so I think that's important to realize, and also to distinguish prediction from decisions. So, what machine learning does is make predictions, make classifications based on the past, but the next step of making a decision based on it is not machine learning. That's a human choice, a policy choice that we have to be careful about.
Can I add something to that? We were talking about the interdisciplinarity of this discussion within academics, but I think I would strongly argue that it's not only necessary to include different academical disciplines into this discussion, but more people. We need to include the greater public, the society, the politicians, companies, the public sector. It's important to have this discussion within academics, but academics is not the entire world, and this technology affects the entire world. So in order to have a democratic dialogue about this, we need to include everyone and not just all the academic disciplines.
Thank you. Let us come to the second part of our discussion. We've talked about how AI might reinforce discrimination, but on the other hand, it could also be an opportunity to uncover or mitigate bias. AlgorithmWatch states on their website about algorithmic decision-making, it carries enormous dangers, it holds enormous promise. Anna, could you perhaps elaborate on what these promises are?
Well, I think it's there's some great technology there. Of course, all of us who are here are fond of technology in some way, and we just believe we shouldn't stop it, like overall, but everyone should profit from it. It should do good for everyone. And there are examples that are good. There are some examples in medicine, like cancer detection of mammographic imagery or so, that are really very, very good, that do help people detect cancers that will prevent them from dying of that cancer. Also, there was, for example, a system set up for distributing students, for 6-year-old students for primary school in the canton of Zurich to different classes and schools, so that the distribution, the variety of the backgrounds of the students would be very mixed, and not that all the similar backgrounds would end up in the same class, which is in the end not good for all of them. So I think there's a lot of promises there because it's a new technology. I mean, the dangers is obvious, but has also been mentioned. And there's another aspect that we think by looking at those systems so much, we might actually detect problems in the analog world that has not been digitalized yet. For example, in the public sector, everything should be, I'll say now, transparent already. You should understand what is being done when you apply for something. But we know for a fact, all of us, that this is not always the case. If we do something, we don't understand if it's paperwork, we don't understand either what they're doing sometimes. Should not be the case. But when they are trying to implement an ADM system and they find out it's not clear to the public what is happening, it's a chance to look at the other processes as well. And it's a chance to also find about systemic discrimination and change that to make the society a better place also outside of ADM systems.
Yeah, these are some great points. And I think we will also come back to this in the third part of our discussion. But now I'd like to quickly go back to something Elliott has touched upon in his introduction. And we will see if that further illustrates the usefulness of AI. So in the year 2011, Shai Danziger and others found in their paper Extraneous Factors in Judicial Decisions that the percentage of favorable rulings by Israeli judges drops gradually from about 65% to nearly zero within a session, separating one meal from another. So arguably, most people would agree that the time at which a case is considered by a judge is a factor that should not have any bearing whatsoever on a fair legal decision. So even without any discriminatory attitude from the human side, we can arrive at a result that is not equitable. So realizing that the status quo is unfair, would you, Elliott, and also the others, advocate the usage of AI in legal decisions, be it assistive or fully automated, despite all of the problems that we have seen that one might run into?
Thank you, David. I think that's a nice framing of the question, that as I alluded to, that when we're thinking about having a machine learning assisted judicial decision making, we're not, the baseline isn't a perfect algorithm, all-knowing algorithm. It's a current human judge, which, before lunch they might be tired and they might rule against you because of this. There's many examples of this. So I think that the solution probably is not replacing all judges immediately with robots. Although there was a poll just this week where a majority of Europeans think would like some of their parliamentarians to be replaced by algorithms. So I think that public opinion is shifting on this. My view is rather than try to go from a world of human judges to robot judges, we could have robot clerks. So we have human judges who are most have the final responsibility for decisions, but many of their costly and effortful tasks, such as doing research on the precedent, identifying relevant evidence, doing interviews, depositions, things like this. Many of those tasks could be delegated to automated systems, and would make information collection more cheaper and give them more time and more energy for the part where humans are best.
In what way would this address this unfairness of the current status quo? So that, like, in the end, if it would be a judge still that would make the decision, wouldn't we expect the same outcomes as we have right now?
I think that remains to be seen. I mean, what I would say is that I wouldn't necessarily replace the final human decision with a machine decision, but I think having machines make a recommendation or point to the relevant factors to try to address these limitations of human decision making would be I think a preferred initial compromise, just to test the waters on this.
Despite potentially opening the door for human bias again. Anyways, do you, Katharina or Anna, have an opinion on this?
Anna, if you have something right up, I'll give you the floor, because I think I'm gonna give a non-answer.
Okay, I can say I mostly I agree with you, Elliott, that some of the clerk work could be delegated to automated systems. It's also being done already with the tax departments all over the place. For example, deciding whether a tax declaration is complicated or not complicated can very well be automated. And I think those kind of tasks also appear for judge work in some place without being a legal expert. But what I do know from collaborating with legal experts is that the law is not as binary as we might think. There's a lot of room for interpretation, and an ADM system cannot do that in the same way as humans can do that. So at that stage where really you have to think and understand and do philosophical arguments in order to determine, based on the laws that you have, what you should judge. This is the place where ADM systems cannot be put into place, and that is also where the final decision is being made.
Yeah, well, maybe on that point, I think that another thing we see, the more and more machine learning creeps into decision-making processes, that we start to reevaluate what it actually means to make a decision, even as a human. Because I think we start to realize that, as we have mentioned before, these issues with judges, for example, it's not just being hungry or not, but in general, this whole idea of accountability and transparency always stops at a certain point. Like, nobody can look into the brain of another person. Like, even as humans, we can try to be as accountable as we can be. We can write everything down we think, but there's always a barrier. And in a certain way, the employment of technologies just highlights this a bit more. Like, this problem and struggle we had before just gets more into the spotlight now, I think.
I'd like to add one more point about that in addition to having automated systems at the level of the decision of the case, for example, trying to automate or support the decision in an individual case, you can imagine having automated systems playing a broader monitoring role. So analyzing broader sets of decisions among populations of judges or courts, and trying to identify outlier judges who, given similar cases, tend to diverge significantly. And so under current systems, that's difficult to do. But for a machine or statistical system, it's pretty easy. And so that's a nice way where algorithms can be discrimination detectors.
So I think before we go over to the third section, we have some time for questions by the audience. So I would now hand over to Ilia, who is going to tell us what the audience is thinking.
So we have one question from the audience that is, what defines a bias and what defines an acceptable feature on which we can base decision on? And how do we find agreement on which characteristics should not be used in algorithmic decision making?
Just a quick point on that. I really like that question, and I think that really just highlights the sort of the limits of kind of technical knowledge and technical know-how, and you very quickly get into these philosophical issues that are debates about them can quickly become intractable. I mentioned like religion as a protected attribute in my example, but you sometimes see lists of 10 or 20 attributes that could or should be protected, and I don't know how you can get the moral authority to draw that line. I think this requires a democratic process, as Anna was mentioning earlier.
Maybe I can add to that. There's actually a huge discussion about this currently in various places politically, also in research. And just if you think about it, there is something such as human rights that we basically worldwide pretty much agreed upon what they should be, like the basic human rights. And because the argument is always it will differ from country to country, from culture to culture, but we did end up with human rights that are pretty much accepted globally. It's another question whether they are followed or not, but we ended up agreeing on them worldwide. So this can be done somehow. It took a lot of work, I assume, but it's possible. So there's some hope there that we can also agree on what should be protected and how.
Are there any more questions in the chat or?
There is one question that also is really interesting is like, do you think humans will be more okay with the decision of a human judge or a robot judge? In general, do you think we trust algorithms more than we trust human judgment?
I can answer this because actually one of my colleagues has answered this question with surveys. It turns out that if you try to frame everything else the same, people do trust a human decision more than an algorithmic decision, but it's not a huge difference. There's many people who think they're the same. When you start adding in, explainability features or information on how accurate they are, some opportunity for a hearing or for appeal, you can actually close this gap. So I think this is still very much an open question, there's reason to think that as people become more educated about it, they might trust it more, or they might be more wary about it. I can see it going either way.
I would like to add to that I would also agree that it's an open question because it depends on more than just one person and their beliefs or knowledge, whether they trust more a human or a robot judge. If we look at, for example, predictive policing, and we think about some person working in the police, and the question that is often asked is whether they will trust their systems more or their instincts or whatever. And this also depends on, for example, what does their team say about these systems? What does their supervisor think about these systems? If I work with such a system and I know my supervisor doesn't like it, and she will look badly at me, I might try to decide in a way to please her. But if I don't agree with the system, but I know my supervisor likes it, I might do what he thinks I should do just in order to get promoted. And then it has the trust in the system, and the question whether I decide like the system suggests or not has nothing to do anymore with the system, but with my work environment. So this is really, really very complicated, and it can be answered in some contexts, but in others, it's really, really very difficult because it gets a huge question that has a lot of factors that are in society or anything else that is not ADM systems at all.
Yeah, if I have a second to maybe elaborate on that, because now what you mentioned, predictive policing, what also came up to me is that in general, there is not such a clear divide between the algorithmic decision and the human decision from time to time. For example, in predictive policing, at least in Germany, the data for predictive policing comes entirely from the official criminal statistic reports, which are obviously humanly built, fed, biased. And so by that, what the predictive policing system puts out is inherently based on how humans report crime, how humans feel about crime, etc. So you can't even make a clear line between what is a human and what is a machine decision, I think, because inherently machine decisions are based on human interpretations of the world. Yeah.
Was that the last question from the chat, or should we move on? Should we?
There's
I think
one.
for this part it's enough.
Yeah.
All right.
There's quite a few more on regulation, so maybe we can add a few minutes there.
All right, we will do that. So thank you very much, the audience and Elia, for reporting the questions by the audience. Maybe I think what we have realized up until now is that AI holds great potential, but also great dangers with regard to fairness in society. In the last part of the discussion now, we want to focus on how we as a society can ensure that the deployment of AI reflects our values and implements the concepts of fairness we desire. We will start off with the following question, namely that given that there are certain concepts of fairness that are fundamentally impossible to be maximized simultaneously, how do we decide what concepts of fairness should be deployed for a given problem class? And how do we deal with the fact that what might be considered fair today might not be considered fair a couple of years down the road? Anyone wants to go forth answering this question?
I can maybe start and then you can join in. First of all, I would like to mention that I don't like to, which you didn't, but I don't want to talk about fair ADM system, but I would like to talk about the fair use of ADM systems, because just like the ADM system, I prefer to call it that way and not artificial intelligence. If you call it fair, it's almost becoming a person. And I prefer not to do that. And then also the second point I would like to make is that is actually to ask a question back at you. How does this question on what we think is fair differ for ADM systems than anything else that we have ever considered to be fair use or fairly done or whatever in other things that we judge or decide? How should this, those things have also changed and we've had to deal with this. How should this be any different for ADM systems? We cannot expect the world to stop just because we have this technology now. The definition of fair has changed tremendously over the last centuries and it will still do so. So we will deal with it the same way that we have dealt with so far. We will adapt, and we cannot just do an ex post assessment of an ADM, because this will exactly not take this into account, but we have to always move on and monitor this world and the society and take this into account when we use these things.
Well, arguably, it is a bit different than it was before, because, for example, one could replace, like, maybe 20, 30, 50 years down the road, one could actually replace a judge by a machine, and one could democratically control the values of this machine, right? One could think that whenever a decision is taken that the majority of the people finds is not good, or not, they don't consider it fair anymore, that then the rule is like revised, so kind of to make that the law becomes a bit more flexible, and that there's not a person that we give this responsibility to decide what's fair, which is basically what we do today, but that we kind of crowdsource this a bit more. I think this would have been hard, let's say 50 years ago.
Okay, I see where you're going. I don't agree with one point you said, is that it's just one person deciding what is fair and what is not fair. I don't think that's the case, because a judge, she cannot decide just on her own what is fair and what is not. She has a huge framework of other legal cases that have been done, of human rights, of laws. It's not just her deciding what is fair. I would disagree with that. And I think we just haven't called it crowdsourcing so far. But there's always been discussions in the parliament about laws. There have been votes in Switzerland since a very long time about laws. You could frame this as crowdsourcing in some way. It just hasn't been called that.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think that there are a set of democratic pressures, but also professional, bureaucratic, other ways for society's values to enter the decision framework for human judges or other, not just legal judges, but just decision makers more generally. And I think that the word fairness, I think Anna is right that the word fairness, it's very loaded, and so it's difficult to talk about with precision, and I think part of this is we can think of like specific decisions as being fair or unfair or inequitable, but also systems are, right? And so when we're thinking about introducing automated decision systems, they might result in some decisions being less fair than a human would make, but they also might make all decisions much more quick. And so, some of my research is in India, for example, and the courts in India are very delayed, and they're very backed up. And so there's some cases that have been there for 20 years. And so even if they get a decision that is like flipping a coin, that might be better than nothing. So we can think about other dimensions of fairness beyond a specific decision and the specific interests of one set of litigants.
Okay, suppose that we agreed on one measure of fairness and we found that, and we are able to train machine learning algorithms that are fair as we find them. There's another problem. In most cases, the exact algorithm and the training data and the development process and all that is inaccessible for the general public. How can we ensure that companies comply with the gold standards that we think of or we develop as researchers? How can we ensure that these algorithms are fair or unbiased if we don't get to see them?
Well, we could make them give access to the code and anything to some experts. We could put that in a law, which is also one suggestion that we have to actually solve this problem, to politically put this there as a law, that it does not everything has to be open access for everyone, because of course there's economical interests that a company has that they would like to keep something secrets, which we can agree on that we could accept that. It depends a little bit, but this is an understandable wish that they have. But they could still be accessible for research. And then they have to sign something that they will never tell anyone else, that they will keep it secret so that a company can still make money out of it. But that could actually be a very useful law that could be put into place.
So these are very interesting ideas. And how far are we right now with this? Like here in Switzerland or in Europe or in the US, like how realistic is it that we will see something like this anytime soon?
I think yeah.
Oh, sorry, Katharina, please.
No. I think you both might have a more educated answer on this, because I would just answer we don't, if we are honest with ourselves. So I think it's very unlikely, to be honest, at the moment, even though we have a lot of great initiatives on the way, but I don't see it happening anytime soon. But maybe you are a bit more optimistic. So.
No, I share Katharina's pessimism about this. I think that it's a problem, and it's related to just the broader issue of a lot of these technologies are being developed in the private sector to drive ad sales and ad targeting and social media addiction. Katharina said something very interesting earlier, that gender stereotypes might be profitable, and I think that is I hope that's not true, but you can imagine some communities where it is, and automated decision systems can be used to make products more addictive, and if researchers and regulators don't have access to the code base, then we only can guess. if that's the case or not. So I think that establishing some kind of review process for regulators or researchers potentially to be able to review the code base and potentially the data even for automated decision systems in the private sector would be helpful. It's also complex, and you know, I don't think there hasn't been a proof of concept yet. One, you know, potentially one optimistic note is I know of some work in the U.S. By my old friend Jack Clark and his organization to produce model cards. So basically, a set of it's kind of voluntary standardization where you make a set of public claims about how your system works, and you know whether it obeys specific constraints, where the data comes from, how it was collected, and things like this. You know, systems are so complex and subtle and different and diverse now that it's hard for us to imagine how this kind of a standardization of information about automated decision systems could come about. But I think this could be a move in the right direction. You know, another example is you know, Facebook has this constitutional court now where they're trying to have basically a Supreme Court make decisions about what posts should be censored and or not. You know, they're taking on the trappings of you know, law and governance. But I think we should be quite skeptical of those types of efforts. And I think having more democratic control will be more helpful in the long run.
I agree with you, Elliott, partially with your pessimism. I would agree with that we're nowhere near where we should be at the moment because the technology is there and it's everywhere in our daily lives. So there should be more than there already is. But I mean, first of all, we're an advocacy organization, so we cannot lose hope. We have to work for those things. And then the EU just published a suggestion for how to regulate AI systems, which is good that they did. We don't agree with everything that they did because we think not everything goes as far as it should. And even though Switzerland is not part of the EU, of course, this also has implications for Switzerland because any system that uses data of a citizen of the EU, it doesn't matter where the system is being used, but if it uses data from the EU and makes a decision about someone in the EU, this regulation will apply. So this will also have an influence for Swiss laws, what will happen here, because we have to, for our companies who are here, there have to be solutions on how to deal with that. So I think some things are moving. There are some suggestions. People are aware that it's important, also politically. Of course, there's a lot of people talking about these things, which slows down those processes, which is a problem, but at least we're talking about it. And another aspect that I find gives some hope is that actually this whole pandemic situation has opened a little bit, at least, the mind of the greater public for those issues. And this could also push some discussions in some of the countries. I mean, in Switzerland, where we have the direct democratic votes and all those things could happen. Maybe not, but maybe they could. Maybe it gain some momentum. We don't know. We cannot really know what happens in the futures, but there is some hope, I think, that it will not just be ignored, at least.
Great. So another arguably important topic that is closely related to this debate is privacy, of course, and European as well as Swiss privacy laws as they are today are, in a sense, on one hand, too restrictive, preventing us from making the most of AI, but on the other hand, too loose to prevent us from being exploited by unfair applications of the technology. So in what direction do you think we have to steer to protect people from harm, but also maximizing the potential of this technology?
Well, I can start. I would just argue that privacy laws don't solve all of the problems, because privacy laws only cover personal data. And there's a lot of things that you can do, even if you don't know anything about personal data of people that can affect society. You can, with statistical methods, find out who the people are, even if you don't have personal data. And this is in no way covered by any of these laws. And this is a huge problem. To just give you a concrete example, if you have all those navigation systems such as Google Maps and so on, they don't have to have personal data in order to affect society. If Google Maps makes you drive through a quiet neighborhood because there's some construction site in the big street that you're actually supposed to drive through, it could have an impact on society, because you drive somewhere where people actually went to live because it's quiet there. They paid a lot of money for their nice, quiet, big houses. And then all of a sudden there's all of this traffic. This has a huge effect on living quality of some people. And it will slow down traffic somewhere else and all of these problems. And there's no personal data involved whatsoever. So there's no law covering this, even though we have all of those privacy laws in place. Another problem, maybe paradox situation that comes out of privacy law is that because of all those things, sometimes it's hard to legally have a database that includes all of the criteria that you need to test whether your system actually is non-discriminatory or not. How can you test that it doesn't discriminate women if you don't include the gender into your database? You can't. You can make your team diverse, you can make your intention very good, but you cannot test it if you don't have that data. And this is a very paradox situation, because it's actually not what was wanted when they were put into place, but it is a problem.
Yeah, maybe adding to the last point, I think that is actually, it's a huge paradox and a huge problem, because legal gender is at least something that, even though not every data set has it, quite a lot of data sets account for legal gender. But when we come to the whole spectrum of sexual orientation, gender identity, we have good reasons why this data is not collected, why those are unobservable characteristics, like we want it that way in a certain way. But obviously, on the other hand, the whole problem is like, how do we know though if we are discriminating against any group then? Because we can't check it. I think it gets even more muddled if we look outside of, for example, I think gender and ethnicity are usually the two markers that are discussed the most, because those are the ones that at least sometimes are collected. But there are a whole bunch of other markers that I think we don't want to actually collect, but on the other hand, we want to know if we are discriminating against those groups. And I have no answer, to be honest, how to solve that paradox.
Do you have anything to add, Elliott? Or do you
no, I think that covers it nicely. I think that's it's an interesting paradox, and I think that many issues in society that come from automated decision making are due to targeted advertising, for example, and without some regulatory restrictions on it, there's going to be a lot of pressures for data collection and privacy violations. So I think that this type of policy area should be informed by the incentives that these companies are facing.
Great. So before taking some final questions from the audience, I'd like to thank you, dear panelists, for sharing your knowledge and engaging in this exciting discussion. But I also want to thank the audience for taking your time today to think about this issue, right? We from the Committee of AI and Society believe it is important, especially for students and technologists who might be involved in deploying or refining the technology to dedicate some of their time to contemplating the potential social consequences of their actions. There is a lot to cheer about AI, and it certainly has the potential to improve the lives of people across the globe, but it also carries the risks of causing a lot of iniquities and suffering. So if we do not get a solid, smart, and social foundation for this technology, it is bound to fail us, and if it does, it might fail us catastrophically. So make use of the tools that are available, such as the fairness trees or this floating chart that we saw Anna and her team have developed, and that can help designers of AI to evaluate the system with regard to different concepts of fairness. Always stay alert and never stop looking carefully. Bias can occur at every stage of the AI lifecycle. That being said, from our side, I hand over once more to you, dear panelists. Do you have any advice or final thoughts for the students as well as the other members of the audience?
So we have one question. How do you feel about the fact that a fairly high amount of research in ML is done by private companies with respect to discrimination and bias? Do you think this on average helps or hurts?
Yeah, this is related to the discussion we had a little bit earlier about regulation of companies and privacy and data collection. I think it's hard to say, whether this is the worst system or the best system. I think that it's fair to say that many corporations they are motivated to collect data to try to make sales and do targeted advertising. And on the other hand, many of these large companies have these research units that have relative freedom and some independence, and most importantly, a lot of resources. So I think in terms of developing effective technologies, this might be a good system, even if it's not optimal. And the alternative system where it was all government funded might have its own problems, or be bureaucratic or too slow, and the government grant agencies might not be able to pick the best technologies.
Yeah, I agree mainly with Elliott. Additionally, I do believe that if research is primarily in the hand of private companies, I mean, we can't expect too much. That's just how it is, to be honest. But it's also something I think we can't change right now. Not how the whole system is built, basically. So I agree that there's potential, and I also think what Elliott touched on as well is that we get into a quite determinist thinking sometimes when it comes to this, like just because private companies employ, for example, machine learning in a certain way doesn't mean that machine learning is the problem, but it's rather that it's mainly used for targeted advertising. That's the problem. It's not the technology itself. And sometimes we ascribe too much meaning into one certain technology, even though the problem lies in a much more structural, much more broader context.
I would add to that the question on whether research has to be funded by the state or by the private sector is a question that is much bigger than just this discipline. That has been going on forever. Also, how independent is the research at a university if the university also receives money from private companies? These kinds of questions, they come in all disciplines. That is one thing. The other thing is there should not be a competition between academia and the corporate sector on who is better, who does the better research. This is pointless. The question should be, how can they learn from each other? How can they interact? How can one kind of research profit from the other? Because both can, actually, if we are being honest. If we go away from this competition, who is actually better? So this is a problem that is much bigger than just the research in machine learning, I would argue.
I want to quickly go back to David's question that was kind of lost in more questions. So regarding your advice for students and maybe also for us, specifically to Anna, you mentioned the European law that is kind of coming right now. What would be initiatives or ways how students could engage in that and like show that they are interested and raise the awareness of that topic?
I think what you could do is actually talk to people who are not studying the same thing than you are studying. Talk to your parents, talk to your friends who study linguistics, talk to your friends who work at the supermarkets, talk to whoever you know about these things and find out how they see those technologies from a completely different view that is not from a technical point of view, because you are learning to be experts on how to make this technology. But I think you can learn a lot from talking to people who are not experts from the technical side. And also try to make someone who's not an expert in that understand what it actually is that you are working on and what it actually the problems are, maybe for someone who's not in academics also. And if you learn to explain those things to other people, you might understand things again for yourself also by the questions that you will be asked. And this will spread the dialogue also further out. And I think this could be helpful both for society, but also for you as a programmer, a software developer, or whatever you are going to be in the future. But it could help everyone.
I'd like to make a somewhat, I hope it's not too mundane, piece of advice, and that is to learn economics. And that I know I'm a little bit biased about this, but I think that many data scientists and machine learning researchers and practitioners that I've talked to, I've spoken with and worked with, they could have benefited from thinking about things from kind of a cost benefit and trade-off and opportunity cost perspective. And I think an example of this is in the Q&A page, someone asks, if an algorithm takes a decision that harms someone, who would be responsible for that? And I think that's an very interesting question philosophically and legally, but there's actually a classic economics concept called the cost theorem that says actually the answer to this doesn't matter that much because whoever is assigned responsibility will then buy an insurance contract and the end result will be the same. So you can assign this responsibility to anyone and then insurance will take care of the risk. And so if you start thinking about many machine learning, the role of machine learning technologies in society and the economy, if you get at that from an incentives and cost benefit perspective, it can be somewhat clarifying.
And maybe I can add to that a bit more radical thought. My advice to students is don't go to Google, don't go to Amazon, don't go to any of those businesses. Because the idea of, even if you have like a pure heart, you have good intentions, this idea of walking through the institutions has never worked. It has never worked. So don't fool yourself believing that you are the ones who will make this happen. So if you think you can revolutionize Google, you can do it maybe on an executive level, but you will not do the revolution as the intern, as the young professional. That's just not happening. Let's not fool ourselves. So if you want to make a change, I would argue either build your own table and make your own thing and be better than them, or go through the advocacy route. But don't try to fix a broken system. Like, just my radical thought on that.
This explains why none of the people we asked from Google to come decided to join the panel discussion. Anyways, are there any more questions in the chat? Ilya?
Like there are other questions, but I think that finishing on this, it's pretty nice. So it depends if like we could discuss it maybe on Wonderme afterwards.
Maybe one more question to the last topic that we talked about. So if you compare companies like Google, Facebook, and all that with OpenAI, who claim to have the goal to democratize AI, what would you think of that?
That OpenAI doesn't have an open source code.
That is a good point.
Yeah, OpenAI is an interesting and unusual organization that started off as a nonprofit, but is now a for-profit organization. But at least on paper, they can only make profit if general artificial intelligence is developed. I do think that OpenAI's incentives are not for short-term profit, and so we shouldn't think about them the same as a startup or Google or Facebook or things like this. But they are now a for-profit organization, so they have some potentially have some economic biases. Also, just to say, I mean, some of the most amazing technology, at least in my research area of natural language processing, has been developed there. So there's, they're having some success.
Thank you. So I think we're at the end of our discussion, and I would hand over to Vincent for some closing words.
Yes, thanks a lot for the panelists, for the moderators, for the questions of the audience. It was, at least from my perspective, very interesting, and I learned a lot. So there will be next events in the field of AI and society, and the dates are already fixed, the topics are not. So that will be September 29th and November 17th. We will post in the chat, and all the people who have signed up also will receive an email with a feedback form. It would be really great if you could fill that out, because it will first give us the chance to improve the event. And second, there will be a question on what is the general topic you would be most interested in, for which we then would try to get the suiting experts who could then debate, hopefully or possibly. This event will then be held on ETH ground, which might exclude some of the people who are listening now, but that's our hope for the future. Then for now, there will be the Wonderme room opened, where all of you can still discuss the remaining questions. I've already seen that in the question tool, some questions received comments that already sparked some kind of discussion. So it seems that also the attendees want to discuss among themselves, and that will be possible right after, basically starting from now. So yes, once more, thanks a lot for the panelists. It was great to have you here. Maybe you can make over for a few minutes in the Wonderme session as well. And for all the attendees, I hope to see you in the Wonderme, and especially also on our next events then in the autumn.